Most investors believe they're structured properly because they filed something. In this episode, you're going to understand three things clearly. First, what building backwards actually means in structural terms. Second, why starting with the operating entity creates exposure instead of insulation. And third, how aligned structure, trust, holding entity, operating entity, changes the institutional classification. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why formation is not foundation, why revenue first thinking creates exposure first structure, and why order determines protection. Most investors start with the operating entity. They form an LLC, they open a bank account, they start generating revenue. They believe they started at the beginning. But structurally, they started at the point of exposure. The operating entity is where contracts happen. It's where revenue happens, and it's also where the risk happens. That's not the foundation. That's the surface layer. Imagine building a house, and instead of pouring the foundation first, you start with walls. You hang the drywall. You install windows. You put on a roof. It looks like it's complete until the weight shifts, until the pressure hits, until stress exposes the missing base. That's how most investors build structure. They build the revenue layer first. They skip the control layer. They skip the continuity layer. They start where the risk lives. From an institutional perspective, order communicates intent. If you start with the operating layer, institutions assume your primary objective was activity, not insulation. Systems don't judge that. They classify it. If exposure came first, exposure becomes the anchor point. Most of you formed your operating entity before thinking about ownership separation. Most of you started with revenue, not risk layering. And most people do. Because formation feels urgent. I need to start. Foundation, on the other hand, feels abstract. You're excited. You want to move. You want revenue. Formation feels like progress. The business operates, money moves, client signs, and nothing's there to contradict the structure. When the risk appears, you discover the operating layer is directly connected to you. This is not about LLC versus corporation. This is about sequence. You can build backwards with any entity type. If the operating entity is formed before ownership, insulation, and continuity are established, the exposure is anchored early. Investor A forms an LLC, operates for 3 years, then thinks about asset protection, then thinks about holding entities, and then trust ownership. By that time, behavior patterns are already set. Authority routing is already set. Financial fallback patterns, They're already set. The structure exists, but order was reversed. Institutions classify behavior based on early behavior patterns. Early structure signals carry weight. If the first 3 years show direct owner-to-operator dependency, later layering appears reactive. Reactive layering does not erase the original classification. Some of you are layering right now, but you started exposed. It doesn't mean you're doomed. It means classification began earlier than you realized. Operating first feels logical because you need revenue. Structure seems fine because nothing is there to challenge it. But when the pressure comes, you realize insulation was never primary. Let's simplify it. Aligned structure does not mean complexity. It simply means order, ownership layer, control layer, operating layer. That's the trust, holding entity, operating entity. The trust establishes continuity beyond the individual. The holding entity owns assets and ownership interests. The operating entity handles contract, revenue, and daily risk, because risk happens at the operating layer. Ownership sits above it, and control sits above exposure. That's forward order. Now, imagine two investors. Investor 1 forms an operating LLC, signs contracts, personally guarantees a lease, and operates for 5 years. Then adds a holding company, considers trust planning, and then there's Investor 2, who establishes the trust ownership first, forms a holding entity. The holding entity forms the operating entity. The operating entity signs the contracts. Both operate businesses, but one built insulation before the exposure. The other added insulation after exposure. The order changes the interpretation. From a global institutional lens, structure is evaluated by risk routing. If the contracts route directly to the individual through behavior patterns, classification forms. If contracts route to an operating entity owned by a holding layer, controlled by a trust layer, classification shifts. Systems see layered independence, not perfect immunity, but structural intent. Some of you started at the surface. Some of you are just now realizing foundation was supposed to come first. Most investors build activity first. Few build insulation first. Revenue urgency drives decisions. Structure seems sufficient because the activity is stable. But pressure reveals whether exposure was insulated or directly anchored. Most investors build backwards because the revenue feels urgent, because foundation feels optional. because exposure doesn't feel real until it's tested. Early investors think, I'll form the LLC now, I'll fix the structure later, let's get moving. Years pass, behavior patterns form, authority concentration forms, guarantee patterns form, then stress hits, and structure reveals the order. Systems evaluate continuity and insulation early. If the early structure shows direct individual to risk routing, systems anchor that pathway. Later layering is viewed as an adjustment, not foundation. You didn't build backwards because you're careless. You built backwards because formation felt like progress. Most investors confuse formation with foundation. They're not the same thing. Formation feels like building. Operation feels like proof. But pressure reveals the foundation sequence. Most investors don't intend to build backwards. They simply start where activity lives instead of where the insulation belongs. Operating entity first, ownership later, continuity maybe someday. That's reversed order. Forward order is insulation first. Ownership above exposure, control above contracts, continuity beyond individuals. Order becomes the interpretation, and interpretation determines classification. Classification determines where responsibility lives. And most investors build their structures backwards. Not because they're reckless, because no one explained that order decides outcome.